everyone. My name's Susie, in case you missed the introduction, and I'm a psychologist. I want to begin by explaining what psychodrama is, because I'm going to be talking about that. It's a technique used in psychotherapy by clients to act out feelings or to role play in order to get a better understanding or insight into their life. The workshop I'm discussing today, called Towards Healing, had the purpose of allowing 6 Germans and 6 Jews to witness the unique personal expressions of each participant whilst in Krakow for 3 days and in Auschwitz for 3 days, and to create a dialogue with one another. This workshop allowed the subjective, not objective, truth of the respective sides to be represented, with all the sorrow, mourning, shame, despair, horror, rage, and guilt that is involved. So this could not be objective, that was subjective. This way, bridges were built, connecting the participants with the family history of opposing sides. Since one of the most difficult experiences for Holocaust survivors and their descendants is the absence of graves to mourn the dead, rituals are also an integral part of psychodrama. They create a new opportunity for burying the dead. This may take the form of religious or memorial ceremonies, poetry, or singing next to an imaginary grave. In the workshop, all are supported by the whole group. It's the community that's needed for holding and containing in such moments. Some examples of rituals are walking barefoot on the railroad tracks leading to the crematorium, throwing glass bottles at the wall in the women's barracks while screaming and crying, listening to a quiet harmonica in a barrack, or sharing dry bread in a circle while eating very slowly. These are just examples of the type of things that are done. All of these rituals are performed by the whole group and create a balance between the individual and the group, a kind of psychosocial healing. Before I give more personal stories from the workshop, I would like to give you a bit of my own background and how the journey came to be. Being born in 1946 in Budapest, I'm a second-generation Holocaust survivor. My mother had lost her entire family in concentration camps, and my father most of his. They did not speak about the war. There was silence, which I found was in common with the Germans, whose families also kept the silence. But I knew that they had been saved by the concierge of their building. My mother first was hidden, and then my father, when he escaped after 2 years in a labour camp back to Budapest, he was also hidden until the end of the war. I knew this because for many years we sent parcels from Australia to this woman. In 2011, I received an email from Courage to Care talking about this workshop. And as soon as I saw that it began in Krakow, I knew I would go, because through ancestry searches, I knew that there was a grave of my great-grandfather times 12. He died in 1654, so 12 generations ago, at the back of the synagogue in Krakow. At last, a grave that I could visit. He had been, just for your interest, he had been a rabbi, the chief rabbi in Prague in the 1600s, and of the old new synagogue, if anyone knows it. His name was Rabbi Yom Tov Lippman Heller. My journey with 2 friends began in 2012 in Budapest, where I found the building that my parents had been hidden in. It was empty at the time, so all I could do was take a lot of photos. The other thing what I was able to do was to find under a mountain of weeds and plants the graves of my great-grandparents, who had obviously died before the war. I was able to organise having it cleaned and restored, and that felt good. Then the journey to Krakow began. The only way we were told to get there was by overnight train, and we were warned that during the night, since we could not lock the door, thieves often come and spray gas onto the people in the compartment to put you into a deep sleep so that they can steal your things. There were 4 of us in a 6-berth compartment, and I decided to stay awake in case this happened. Our only stop was Bratislava at midnight, and someone was trying to open the sliding door and get in. After a lot of screaming and hysterics from me, it turned out that there were 2 new passengers for the empty bunks. Only once we got safely to Krakow did I realise the parallel, even though minute in comparison to the scary trip to Poland that many of my relatives had made in cattle cars to be gassed. On arrival at the workshop, we met Yakov Naor, who was son of Holocaust survivors, born in a displaced persons camp and moved with his parents to Israel at the age of 1. And also Hilda Goethe, whose grandparents served in the Nazi army. They were the leaders of the group and wanted to teach people to listen and respect each other and to create a dialogue with one another and to witness the unique personal expressions of participants rather than reconciliation. They thought that was too hard to aim for in this workshop. And I certainly thought the same at that time. As we went on our first excursion to the Galicia Jewish Museum in Krakow, I thought good about the not expecting reconciliation, because I can't imagine ever being reconciled with a German. All my life up till then, I had decided I would never go to Germany. And, you know, I had that feeling left over, I suppose, from my parents, even though they never said anything. In a way, maybe it was because they didn't say anything. The task in the museum was to pair up with someone you didn't know and walk around and speak about how you felt when you looked at any one of the things that you saw. As I said, we did it in pairs, and I was amazed to hear from Germans and Jews the common themes of loss and pain and the silence that we had experienced within our families. I hadn't realised up till then that in Germany they didn't teach anything about World War II for many, many years after the war. So children who were born after the ending of the war did not know what had happened. The next day we were leaving by train for Auschwitz and happened to be on the wrong platform, so we missed the train. We had to stand there for another hour waiting for the next one. And I've got to say that felt very creepy, you know, waiting for a train to Auschwitz. After a guided tour, which was horrendous, in that we were given little hearing headphones, and the tour guide, who was Polish, had a microphone, and so we could hear what she was saying, but she didn't stay with us at all. She just wandered off, but we could hear her. And so she was very detached and impersonal. And at one stage, if anyone's been to Auschwitz, you'd know there is a very large room with a glass wall full of hair. And I asked her the question, what did they need the hair for? And she said to me, they took it to Germany to make mattresses. They were having a hard time, you know. I was just bursting with anger. Anyway, we continued on, and then My friend and I, and we were the only two who had had family die in Auschwitz, we had brought candles from Australia to light there in honour of our relatives. And we decided to light them. And there's an area, again, if you've been there, you know, there's an area where people can light candles. It had been very windy, and all the candles that had already been lit had gone out. So we decided to light all of them. Amazingly, one of the Germans in my group, Abraham, had been to Israel and had learned Hebrew and said he would say Kaddish with us. The group stood around us in silence while we lit about 100 candles. And then we said Kaddish together. This was an extremely moving experience, and I felt totally supported by the group, the whole group. The next day, we went quietly by ourselves around Birkenau, which is where the gas chambers were. We were asked to wander around and choose a spot where we would like to act something out the next day in psychodrama. For those who haven't been to Birkenau, it's where the cattle cars arrived and people were asked to go left or right to either work or be killed immediately. There are also barracks and remnants of the gas chambers. On that last day, my psychodrama, I asked the group to take different parts and to act out my uncle's journey to Auschwitz, which he had survived and told me about. People in the, I'll tell you afterwards, the cattle car that he was in passed through his country town in Hungary called Potok, and his father had heard about that and had bribed someone at the station to allow the train to stop for a minute. He spoke to my uncle, that's his son, through a crack and was able to pass him a potato, which he lived on for the next few weeks, a little each day. That was the last time he ever saw his father, who was also taken to Auschwitz and then was gassed. The way this was acted out is everybody had a part in this psychodrama. A couple of people took the part of the actual cattle car and they held their fingers up like this to be the crack. Others were Jews in the cattle car, and then there was my grandfather outside and my uncle inside, and they acted out what had happened. The whole group was very moved, and it was very therapeutic, I must say. Another story was a German woman who asked us all to gather around in a circle around what she said were the graves of her parents who had been in the SS and who had committed suicide. And she asked us to scream and shout at her parents with her that she condemned them to live forever and not die and observe the pain they had caused forever. This woman was absolutely shattered and felt guilty on behalf of her parents and the whole German community. I felt great compassion towards her. Another German woman told the story of how when she was a teenager at university, she was sitting with her friends around a table when she saw a newspaper that her grandfather, who she adored, had been arrested for war crimes. She had no idea that this was in his past, and she could not recover. She had done this workshop several times trying to recover from that. Again, I felt very great compassion. When everyone had their turns, some saying poetry, others doing drawings, I felt as if we were one cohesive group who had all felt a great deal of pain and understood each other a lot better. We left the workshop with links between participants strengthened to the extent that I have now visited them in Berlin twice and stayed with another in Vienna, something I could never have imagined. I had moved from projections and generalizations to the process of learning and empathy. We were all witnesses to the stories of others and gave space for their narratives and experienced acceptance. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie, for that incredibly moving testimonial that you've given us, and it'll be a I'm sure a very interesting introduction to our next speakers. It was an incredibly moving experience, and considering that this actually happened now nearly 9 years ago, you still sort of teared over when you spoke about the candles. It's something that you can't really ever get over. And I think most of us here will appreciate. Many of us will know exactly how you felt. I don't know who, whether Naomi or Derek are going to speak first. Have they indicated, Anna, have they indicated who will speak first? Well, in that case, I will introduce Naomi first, and I'd like to welcome you to our meeting in Australia, and I really appreciate you giving your presentation, which came highly recommended from B'nai B'rith UK, from Alan and Edna Miller. Dr. Noemie Lopian is the daughter of Holocaust survivors, Dr. Ernest Israel Bornstein and Renee Bornstein. Naomi lived in Germany until the age of 13 before moving to Manchester, England. She qualified as a GP and for the last few years has dedicated her time to educating and commemorating the Holocaust, continuing the legacy of her parents. She has spent 3 years translating her father Ernest's memoirs into her book, The Long Night, Toby Press 2016. The Long Night has been featured on BBC Radio and Television and ITV News, in addition to articles and reviews in The Guardian, The Daily Mail, The Express, The Jewish News, and The Jewish Chronicle. Her mum's story was retraced by Naomi in the BBC One programme, My Family, The Holocaust and Me, and 2 weeks ago in the Mail on Sunday, You Magazine and Renee Bernstein. So please, everybody, welcome Naomi.
Thank you very much, but I'm going to hand over. We co-present together, so it's very nice how you'll meet us to Derek, who will begin, and then I follow, and then it's back to Derek. So over to Derek, and thank you. I don't know whether you want to introduce Derek at the same time. Is that okay?
Oh, I'm sure. Is that okay? Yes. Lovely. So I'll introduce Derek, and then we'll know who's who and what's what.
Yes.
Derek Niemann is a nature writer and a teacher of creative writing to Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education. He contributes a very small twice-monthly column to the Guardian newspaper. Derek lives in Bedfordshire, 15 miles away from the village of Melbourne, the other one, he writes. Thank you. Welcome, Derek, and welcome, Naomi. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. Noemie and I would have loved to have been with you in person tonight. In fact, we even got to the airport, but then a lot of tennis players took our seats. But seriously, I'm going to take you back 3 years to a B'nai B'rith meeting in North London. And I was giving a talk on my grandfather's dreadful story. And at the end, the lady came up to me and said, "I want us to talk together." And I thought this was an extraordinary thing, an act of courage, an act of imagination. That lady was Noemie. And ever since then, we have been talking together, standing together on the same stage, talking to schools, universities, at synagogues, government departments in the UK, and now to you in Melbourne. And our message is about togetherness, tolerance, and understanding of others. And so it's fitting that one of us introduces the other, but we only decide on the day who is going to interview who or introduce who. So I'm now introducing Noemie, who will tell us a little bit about her story.
Thank you so much, Derek, and thank you all, dear friends, and a very good evening. I came to the Holocaust relatively late in life. I grew up, as you heard in the introduction, in Munich in Germany till the age of 13, with a love of the people there and a love of the city, admiring the beauty, particularly as a child. Christmas in Munich, it was magical. My father was a doctor and a dentist post-war, and he did something that nowadays would not be deemed kosher. He adopted a patient, and she became our grandmother, our beloved grandmother. We called her the same name as we called my mother's mother, Mimi. She was a Catholic lady, and I've no idea where she was widowed with no children and no family. And I have no idea where her family were in the war, what part they played, nor when I asked my mother today, does she know? So we accepted her and she us. And she taught me about her ways of life. As a child, I just accepted that and I just adored her. My father passed away when I turned 12, and the following years, you heard, we moved to Manchester. Very much like your first speaker said, I was unaware of my parents' past in the Holocaust. I was unaware of Munich's role during the Holocaust. I had no idea. I went to a Jewish kindergarten and then a Jewish primary school, which after the Munich Olympics in 1972 was guarded by police with machine guns. Again, as a child, it was strange in the beginning, but I learned to accept. And following that, I went to high school at a young age, at the age of 9, because my father grew up in Poland believing that I should go to school young like he did. And my contemporaries were 11, 12. In Germany, they believed to go a year later than in other countries of Europe. So there was a discrepancy. But to this day, I've kept a friend who actually, we did lose touch. He only contacted me a year and a half ago and had fond memories of me as a person, which really touched me, because I have to tell you, when I did go to high school, I didn't like being Jewish. I didn't like, not what happened at home or any of that. I just didn't like being the other. I so craved to fit in. And so for the first time, I found out about the Shoah with my peers. In Germany, we had to go to religious lessons. It was obligatory. And because I wasn't of the faith of the country, those who were agnostics or of different faith had to go to ethics lessons. And they were interesting. Every week was a different topic. And one week it was the Shoah. Ladies and gentlemen, I can't tell you what happened in that lesson very much, the talk. Not because it happened a long time ago. The not remembering happened immediately because I was in shock. But I did remember then, and to this day, the 3 pictures that I saw. And those were a picture of a crater of bones, a picture of a crater of glasses, and a picture of a crater of hair. And I looked at my peers who didn't know anything either. We were 13 years old. And I came home to my mother asking her, was it really true? I so hoped that it was a fable by the Brothers Grimm. That was the first time I found out. And I shelved it. We moved, like I say, to Manchester. My father passed away. There was a lot of things to be getting on with. I concentrated on getting my qualifications and got married young, simultaneously embarking on a medical career and having a baby in my second year uni. So I was swimming and just learning to cope and deal with my new life, as it were. And when I was on maternity leave at the age of 36, I began to read The Long Night. And I have to tell you, as I told Derek and his dear wife, Sarah, I grew up with The Long Night on my mother's shelf. My mother's French and has a beautiful lounge, very ornate. But The Long Night was on its own on that shelf. And so many friends more recently commented, we always saw The Long Night. But you see, I managed to ignore The Long Night. I knew there was a story in there because when we asked my dad, tell us about your past, it was more of a thing to hear the stories or imagine him, your parent. He was an elderly father. As a child, there was this fascination, and he would grace us with stories, funny stories, but never, of course, the war story. He said, there is something for you in The Long Night. And when I read it, and when I closed the book, I had a choice. I felt that if I closed the book, I would close the book to my father, his family, his friends, our community, our people. How could I do that? So that's how I embarked to translate the book, and it sort of grew from there. My dad, I'll tell you briefly, was 17 in 1939 and was taken away in March 1941. His mother and parents used to beg him to go into hiding, but he was already an old teenager by then and sometimes got fed up of hiding. And on that fateful night, the Germans came to their flat. He ran to a neighboring flat, but couldn't hide very well. It was too late, and they beat him out with clubs. In the first labor camp in Grünheide, he met up with his father again, and he actually managed to get his father sent home through little deals and friendships and bribery, because his father had become quite poorly. Unfortunately, of course, as many others, he didn't survive. His father and mother and two siblings, my father was the eldest of four, whose name I carry, his sisters, were gassed in Auschwitz in 1943. My parents, my mum still said recently, never spoke to each other about the Shoah in their marriage, nor, believe it or not, did my dad know about my mum's fate. My father was in the camps and then subsequently in concentration camps for 4.5 years, and he was liberated by the Americans in April 1945. I will read you a little passage from the book later, because I always say my father's voice is the authentic voice and so much more powerful than when I paraphrase. My mum is French. My dad was Polish. And my mum grew up in Alsace, in France, in Strasbourg. And she was 5 in 1939. And Jewish people and non-Jewish people were evacuated because the Germans had invaded. My mum was evacuated to Saint-Junien, a little village near the Limoges, where they produce china to this day. My mum described Saint-Junien initially as a happy time because there were fields and she could play outdoors. They didn't have much school because they were Jewish and had to go to a different school, and her school was such that all the ages were together in one classroom. But as time passed, the presence of the Germans was very much felt in the little town. And 1943, 1944, they had increasing roundups where the Germans would just come and pick children off the streets. This is no exaggeration. And entire families disappeared just overnight. In that region called Haute-Savoie, there was a very active underground, Jewish underground, Le Maquis. And my grandparents had good friends And in particular, my mum speaks very fondly of their friend GP, Dr. Epstein, who'd sort of adopted my mum's family because they were childless. And he kept encouraging my grandparents to send my mum, who was in 1944 then just reached 10, and her older sister Helen, 13, and her brother Joey away to Switzerland to safety, where many children had already gone. It was a very difficult decision for my grandparents. They'd been offered it for a while, and they always refused. My grandma couldn't bear to be separated. However, my grandparents did make the decision, and my mum was sent away together with her sister and brother in 1944, May. And initially they went to Limoges, the next town that I mentioned, to a convent for 2 weeks. There they actually tried to baptize my mum. They took each child, my mum says, individually, the nuns, and said, Renee, you know you're going to die. And when you die, we want you to go to paradise. But if you're not baptized and remain a Jew, you will go to hell. Renee's faith, the little girl of 10, was very strong, and she refused. Renee also remembers seeing a young girl of 15 who, in her own words, she says, had lost her mind because she'd seen her parents murdered before her eyes, shot. This girl had a vacant look, and the nuns did baptize her. The children were made to get up at 6 in the morning, go to chapel, and were busied the rest of the day by tending to the fields. It was a season of asparagus, and they had to do the weeding and the picking. They stayed there for 2 weeks, and then they moved on to Lyon, where there was a lot of bombing going on, and they had to hide in cellars for 2 days. Each time when they changed location, a different young woman would mind them. From Lyon, they traveled to Annecy, which is a beautiful city in the Alps in France. As you heard, I retraced my mother's journey. So I saw it with my very own eyes, and I was in the same place where my mother was, which gave me a whole different dimension of my mum. I'll tell you a bit about it maybe in the questions. And I saw what my mum saw, what little Renee saw, Helen, age 13, Joey, 9. And by then there were a group of 32 children, all who had joined all over France. They saw the Alps, across the lake. They saw freedom. They smelled freedom. They were nearly there in Switzerland. They were greeted by a young woman called Marianne Conn, who had a special warmth. And my mum to this day said she was so reassuring, and they felt safe, happy, and almost free. Marianne told them that they'd missed the train and that she'd arranged a car, and that in that car they would travel to Switzerland. It wouldn't be very far. They traveled to the border. It was hot. It was June by then. And they traveled in those cars that you might have seen on pictures with a very sort of heavy cotton green, very thick covering. They were sweaty and hot. Suddenly the car came screeched to a halt. They peeped out. They had to keep quiet and on the whole weren't allowed to peep out. And they saw a car with 4 German soldiers in uniform jump out and ask them to get out. And then they noticed that behind them was a whole group of Germans in a van with dogs and machine guns. Marianne jumped out and said that these were children from the rail workers in Lyon, and she was taking them to a holiday camp in Switzerland because it wasn't safe to the children to be in the station or nearby where the city was being bombed. So the Germans said, "We'll follow you." And they followed them, and they went to that holiday home. And the woman was already at the door. My mum, Renee, says she can see her face to this day. And the woman said, "We're not expecting boys and girls, we're just expecting boys." So the older children were immediately taken to the neighboring town of Annemasse and to the prison there, the Prison du Pax. And my mum stayed a few hours, was actually already interrogated then, little Renee of 10. And then they were moved in the early hours of the morning to the prison. Marianne in that prison, the guardian, was in a separate part and went out during the day to work for the first few days. And then she came back being tortured. The person that looked after them in prison was the Lord Mayor of the town called Jean de Faux, who made sure the children have food, although René can't remember much food. Marianne, René and Helen and Joy were interrogated every day at gunpoint, asking repeatedly, "Are you Jewish? What's your name? What's your parents' name? Where do your parents live?" And this happened every morning. René could never speak. She was terrified, and it probably saved them, nor Helen nor Joy. They at one day witnessed a boy being beaten up. Marianne came home from work after a few days in prison with my mum, always does this, her head twice her size, having been tortured and beaten. Marianne told the children to say everything to the Germans. Marianne was raped, tortured and murdered on the 8th of July 1944 and was later found in a ditch. Marianne had the chance to escape but wouldn't leave the children. Numerous times the underground begged her to go and leave the children. The Lord Mayor of the town made a double deal with the Gestapo, saying he'll help them escape because the war was lost, but he'd look after the children, and he did. And my mum, in the end of June, managed to reach Geneva in safety. I think I'm almost up to time, so I will just read you one little passage of my father's book and leave you with that and hand over to Derek. After so many years, can one now relate events, thoughts and feelings as one saw, thought and felt them? Probably not. How does a person
The wee tot on his bench, that's me. The bigger boy behind me is my brother. And the man behind them is my dad, Rudolf Adolf August Martin Wilhelm Niemann. My dad came over from Germany, followed his sister who had married a Scottish soldier. And on one occasion, his brother visited us from Germany. And his brother brought my own brother and I the best possible present. And I have it here, or I have an example. Lederhosen. We put that lederhosen on. It was incredibly strong. We went all around the garden, scampering around, scratched in the bushes, but the lederhosen was solid leather and it survived. Germany's greatest invention, Vorsprung durch Technik. But here's the thing. You can see the gate behind that photograph. My mum said that when wee boys were wearing our lederhosen, she said she would never let us outside the gate in case the neighbours realised that we had a connection with Germany. And I didn't know what that connection was until just a few years ago. As Susie said earlier, Germans kept the silence. I'm now going to take you through the story of my grandfather and his family very, very quickly. And it began in the most innocuous of circumstances. Here he is in 1921, around the time of his marriage with my grandmother, Mina. But look here, a couple showing each other tender looks, but that represents a man who signed up for war in 1914, who fought in the worst, bloodiest battles of the First World War at Verdun, the Somme. He was wounded and taken prisoner at Passchendaele. He stayed in a prisoner of war camp until 1920, when the Versailles Treaty was signed. He came back to Germany, and like many other young men returning from war, saw a country in a state of collapse. And like many other young men, he was looking for people to blame. And the Nazis, of course, steered him in the direction of the Jews. But for some years, he did nothing politically. He started to raise a family. My aunt, who eventually ended up in Scotland, and her wee brother, Dieter. This is them pictured in Dortmund, 1927. My grandfather had been a bank clerk, but then went to work in a printing company. And he took lots of photographs. He was a very good photographer. He took this beautiful Christmas scene. And as an old soldier, he took photographs in the market square of a military parade. There are no swastikas in this picture. This is before Hitler. 1930, his political awakening came. He joined the Nazi Party, and now he's taking photographs. Remember, photographs were expensive. If you took a photograph, it was because you had a reason. And he took 2 photographs of this stormtrooper parade. Dortmund was a socialist city. The Nazis were very much in the minority, but my grandfather was a paid-up member. Not just a member, he was an active party official. At the end of his day job, he would go around people's houses as a Nazi party official and ask them for their political views. And if they didn't accord with the views of the new chancellor, who's now in power, then he was supposed to report them to the Gestapo. This photograph of him looking like Oliver Hardy dates from 1934. Why do I know that? Because my dad's in there. And we move on now till 1935. This looks, on the face of it, to be a happy family photograph, smiling, happy children. But I think you can recognize some of the insidious signs. You can recognize the belt of a member of the Hitler Youth, the coat of a young girl who's in the girls section of the Hitler Youth. My dad wearing a very nice bobble hat. The man behind the camera, though, is now in a situation of economic risk. He's lost his job for whatever reason. He has no money. He says to his landlord, I can't pay the rent. But he has a friend who says, I know somebody who can get you out of this. He happened to go to the same school of you in the Pied Piper town of Hameln. And he is also Heinrich Himmler's deputy in the SS. And so my grandfather went to the seriously dark side. He went to Dachau to train to become an SS officer. He took plenty of photographs of his colleagues. I don't know who these people are. But I do know that this photograph was taken on the exact location of the visitor center at Dachau concentration camp today. My grandfather, was he supposed to take this? It's slightly blurred. Perhaps he's excited. The man there on the left is giving the Hitler salute, perhaps to a very senior figure there. And at that time, my grandfather was working as an auditor for the SS. At first, he didn't work in the concentration camp itself. Oops. Let's see if I can go back. Oh dear. I'll just try and go backwards. Oh dear, no. Oh dear. Ah, here we are. Success. Sorry about this. We're going through time very quickly. By the end of 1938, the family had moved to Berlin. My grandfather's job had changed. And now we have 4 little children in a kind of scene from Heidi, a perfect estate on the edge of the forest of Grunewald. This is idyllic living, this is. What of the grown-ups? My wife Sarah and I call this photograph the Nazi party. They're all absolutely rat-arsed. We can date it exactly. This lady here is wearing a tiara with 1939 on it. It's New Year's Eve, 1938. We are 6 weeks after Kristallnacht. But hey, they're having a good time. Somebody could please mute whatever they've got on. That would be very helpful. Thank you. We move forward now. We're in 1940. We're only a year away from Noemie's father being taken prisoner. And yet this family are acting as if life goes on. My aunt's here with a wardrobe malfunction. My uncle playing with his brother's belt. And my dad hitching up his trousers so hard it's amazing he managed to have 2 children. Berlin is being bombed. The center of Berlin is being bombed. But this estate, an estate that was built for the SS on Himmler's orders, not one house was hit, not one house was struck. Before he died, I asked my father, what was your dad like? He said he was a distant man and he was always going off to work. He was always going away on business. His chauffeur would pick him up, drive him away, and then a couple of days later he would come back ready to go again. And here he is on one of his off moments. Would you believe doing the gardening? And here we have the family bunker. My dad remembered the people who came to build the bunker, the people who came to do the gas, the electricity, mend clothes. He described them as people wearing dirty clothes, striped clothes. They called them Fatih's workers. At 16, his older brother was put into the army. He was taken out of school. That sounds pretty grim, having to sit every night at a gun and shoot at the Allied bombers coming across, until you realise that at the exact same time, Noemie's grandparents and her uncle and aunt were being gassed at Auschwitz. The boy Dieter went on training exercises and took the family camera with him. And one thing I can say about Dieter was he's the world's worst photographer. He didn't quite understand about chopping heads and feet off. And there we are again. But by 18, well, you may have sent your children to university at 18. My grandfather sent his own son to die. There is Dieter on the left. He's sent to the Panzers, the tank regiment, where the chances of survival were 5%. This is the last photograph taken of him, Christmas 1944. After that, he went to Bavaria and was never seen again. And at the end of March 1945, my grandfather came home and told the family, we're being relocated to the Alps. Both my father and his brother could remember the journey down there and could remember that they stopped somewhere on the way. My wife and I followed that same route. We stopped here at Dachau. Just before we went to Dachau, I rang my dad and told him we were going there. He told me a story that is chilling and is absolutely true. And I apologize in advance at this point. This is the hardest part of this talk. He told me he could remember they were put up in a barracks hut. He was looking out over a low building with a tall chimney. He remembered his parents standing at the window. He remembered his mother saying, you know what they're doing there? His father said, no. His mother said, they're killing them. They're killing the Jews and burning the bodies. His father said, no, they wouldn't do that. She replied, "Of course they would. Can't you smell the flesh?" By now I knew exactly who my grandfather was. His factories, his journeys were to the concentration camps. Those were the factories, and the inmates were his workers. I went to see the archivists at both Sachsenhausen and Dachau. And at Dachau I said, is it just possible that my grandfather could have visited these places, visited Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and not understood from the dead bodies, the beatings, the skeletal figures, what was going on? And they said, it is impossible. My wife took this photograph of me as I stepped out of the archive, and I have no memory of her taking it. That's the tricky bit. We left Dachau as the family did and made for the Alps, the same valley. We went up this valley as they did. And on the last day of the war, my dad watched an American Jeep coming up the track. 4 heavily armed American soldiers jumped out. They grabbed his sister, stuck a gun in her back, and said, "Take us to your Nazi." My dad and the rest watched as my grandfather was beaten up a bit and taken away. What could the rest of the family do? Nothing but go down to the nearest town. War had ended the day before. And here is my dad wearing an American soldier's helmet. The war is over. Kids play with the soldiers. It always happens after a war. Now we move forward in time. It's 1950. My aunt has married a Scottish soldier and returned for the summer to be with her family. The family together, the one in the middle, my Uncle Dieter, the dead son. My grandmother kept this photograph of him on her wall for the rest of her days. We sent it to the Imperial War Museum, and they said this is the uniform of an SS private with the lapel obscured. A little bit of Photoshop reveals the SS flashes that my grandmother penciled out so that she could put this picture up. All through researching this story and writing my book about it, I had somebody supporting me in Germany. His name is Bernhard Gelderblom, and he discovered that his own grandfather had committed atrocities in the Holocaust. And Bernhard told me that he could accept that, but what he couldn't accept was that his father would say, "I would do it again." And Bernhard decided when he retired as a history teacher that he would dedicate his life to taking children from the Hameln and the nearby towns to the Jewish cemeteries to tell them about the story of the communities that lived there before. And he even managed to get their parents to restore the gravestones that were smashed in Kristallnacht. This is Hameln's Jewish graveyard, and it's opposite the graveyard where both my grandparents were buried. I look now at 2 very different families. The wee family in Scotland that hid the story for 70 years. And then Noemie's father, Ernst, and now her mother, Lene, telling a story that must not be forgotten. And it passes now to Noemie and I to tell a story from both sides together and show that Nazis tried to kill kindness, but we fight that with your help. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
And
Are there any?
Derek, I just want to just quickly say, I don't think there's a dry eye in the house. We've all been tremendously moved by your presentations. Both amazing stories, and because many of us in Australia are Holocaust survivors or children of Holocaust survivors, we have been tremendously touched by it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
And now I would like to call on Janine Zimbler to give the vote of thanks and to present our speaker here, person with such a kind gift. Janine, if I may call upon you. Oh, you say.
I think on behalf of all of us, I'm expressing our gratitude to Noemie and Derek and Susie for sharing their stories, the pain, suffering, shame, guilt with us. Because I think we're now asking ourselves, who were these people? How come they did what they did? Were they human? Were they like us? And I suppose in a way, yes, they were. And I think it makes it even more real and even more frightening and even more terrifying. And it happened then, and it's still happening today. Different parts of the world. What we've seen over and over again. I think it makes it even more horrific. That we don't see judgment anymore. So, I first want to say what a huge shock, I must say, it was to hear Derek's story and to thank him for being so vulnerable and coming to share it. Respect, I think, is everyone's courage. They kept it quiet for whatever seemed. So that was a really amazing thing that he shared with us. And to Noemie for being open and willing to start a dialogue. And finally to Susie, thank you for sharing. It put us, your contributions sort of put us back into the moment, so that we were really ready to move on to what happened. It really set the context, and thank you for sharing what was terribly difficult for you with us as well. Thank you. Okay, any questions that anyone would like to ask? Okay, Niemann, would you like to share your story with us? This is to come stand at the microphone so everyone can hear. I'm addressing myself to mainly Naomi, because what you said, Naomi, in your story, my mother comes from Alsace-Lorraine, from Strasbourg to be precise, and we started the war there. My family evacuated to Périgueux, and I was a little girl of 20 months old, and then we went on near Limoges, went to a few places, and we ended up in Felta, which is not too far from Limoges, and we moved, and there, which is a small town, and there were a few Jewish families, 13 to be precise, and there the Gestapo, or the milice to be probably, I was never told, my parents didn't speak much about it, came with our names on a list of the 13 families. We were managed to escape because we were warned by the chief of police, and all the families, with the exception of one, managed to save themselves. And in that, and that one family, unfortunately, couldn't be saved. They weren't warned. The father managed, because you're talking about the roundups. The father, there was a fear, you know, young men were going to be picked up. And my parents, I don't think, had any knowledge of anything else. So his wife apparently persuaded him to leave, and she remained with her 3 children and her father-in-law. They were taken away, and I just recently found their names on the second last convoy out of France to Auschwitz, where they perished. And how I found that out was 3 years ago, on my 80th birthday. I want you to know I was very emotional. My grandson, who's in Israel, decided to do some research, and he found the name Feltin and the 4th of November 1943. And it was a book written by a man whose stepfather was the man who had escaped from the milice, and his wife and children had perished. Now that is a story in parallel. I met and married a young man from Paris who ended up in a children's home with his brother and sister, who and they were near Lyon, and they were also sought. They were with Rabbi Zalman Schneerson's group, about 120 boys and girls, and they managed to, like your mother, be taken towards Switzerland because they were going to get these kids across the border into Switzerland. Small groups were made up, and my husband didn't talk much about it, but I know small groups were made up of about 6 kids or 8 kids. My sister-in-law, who was a 15-and-a-half-year-old girl, guided these children across into Switzerland. After the 3rd attempt, she managed to get them in. And why 15 and a half? She wasn't an adult. And you talk about your mothers being told not to talk. My sister-in-law was savvy enough to say to her brothers, don't say a word to anyone or anything, because it was the Swiss who were doing the questioning. The Swiss who were questioning these children, these young children. My husband was just 10 years old. He was born in 1933. He went across in 1943. I guesstimate it was August or September because he was talking about Rosh Hashanah and looking for a shofar. So my story and my life and your parents' life intersected dramatically. We both my husband and I lost our maternal families because they were all in Poland, and paternal families. And so I'm another one. I'm another witness because I went through it. I was 6 years old in 1943. And I remember those days. So thank you very much. You're very eloquent, and it moved me a great deal. Really did. Thank you.
Is there anybody else who'd like to share something or ask a question or address it to Noemie and Derek? That's Andrew. Andrew? No?
No.
Is there anybody online on Zoom who'd like to ask a question? Perhaps you could put your hand up so we could identify you.
Or unmute themselves.
Or you'd need to unmute yourself. There's a hand I can see. Gilda, is it?
Muted me. Right. My statement is directed at Derek. Derek, I am so impressed to hear your story, to hear the bravery in recounting it and telling the world where and what your parents or grandparents were doing. That takes strength beyond words. I myself am also a 2nd-generation Holocaust survivor. My parents were both in the camps. I had a sister of 5 who was murdered in Auschwitz. I'm not going into my family story. We've heard enough eloquent stories from others. But just to say, Derek, I am so impressed with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gilda. That was beautifully expressed, and I'm sorry for your losses all that time ago.
Okay.
Derek, can I ask you a question?
Yes, please do.
My name's Donald Frommer. My parents managed to get out of Germany just in time, so that's why I'm still alive. Can you tell me what happened to your SS grandfather after the American soldiers picked him up? And secondly, how much did your father know about what his father had done?
Very interesting questions, thank you. My grandfather was taken by the Americans and held in former prisoner of war camps for a total of 3 years, which doesn't sound much, but actually he spent longer in a POW camp than most former SS. He was one of the last from the bulk of them to be released. I think my father knew a reasonable amount, but like so many Germans, there was an expression in Germany, Schwamm darüber, meaning just wipe it away. And so the family almost pretended it hadn't happened. So that it got to the point where when I finally found out from my father about his own father's story, he'd almost forgotten that it happened. I don't think he was telling lies, although he did tell lies, but I don't think he realized he did. I didn't know until I discovered my grandfather by a random search online that he'd even been in the SS. And that was in 2011. That was a shock. And it was only then that I started asking my father, having gone to Berlin to read the records of what my grandfather had been doing, it was only then that I began to discover from my father and his brother, who still lives in Germany, about their father's story. And one thing I have to say is that my uncle is the antithesis of a Nazi. He read the draft of my book and said, I find this very hard, but this is the truth and you must tell this story. And he and his wife, before lockdown started, were looking to get Noemie and I places to speak in Germany about our story. So he and his wife are tremendous advocates for tolerance and understanding.
Thank you very much.
Is there anybody else? Oh, Linda Wrightson would like to come and speak. Just from here? No. My question is to both Derek and Noemie. What do you make of the situation today where anti-Semitism is so rife? The neo-Nazis are running around, and it seems like there's a possibility that things might start to happen again.
I have to say, unfortunately, I agree with you, and I can't believe that I say that, because one sort of always heard the never again, and I knew the survivors. When my father spoke in Dachau, it was, warning and remembrance. He had a thing to warn, to educate. There is a rise from all sides, I feel, from the far right, the far left, the extreme jihadi, and globally there's a huge unrest already pre-Trump. I always call it the silent Third World War. But I believe in education. And that is particularly our young people at schools, at university. But it was also eye-opening when Derek and I went to the cabinet offices and we spoke to judges. And recently with my mum's story, there were young editors in this big newspaper, the Mail, how little they know about it, how little they understand about it. And often the messages to these groups is that we all belong to one race, and that's the human race. And really accept that I feel human beings are inherently racist. We don't like the other. We don't like difference. And you know, social media play up on that, and the algorithms, they always give us like-minded and like-minded. And that we have to educate about difference, but how much we grow from difference. If we keep in our same echo chamber, it's boring and we don't actually evolve. But if we do, and so it's a process. It's difficult. I don't know where the world is going, and you know, human memory, it fades. So it's more important. It falls on second generations. It falls on everybody to become witness and to do their bit, and to peel the Holocaust and anti-Semitism right back to what in Yiddish we call being a mensch, you know, being a decent human being. And sadly, I feel that needs to get taught.
And if I can just follow up on what Noemie said, I mean, obviously one thing that's happened is that Noemie has approached the grandson of an SS officer and asked if we can speak together. And that took guts. Now, I'll go back to earlier last year when we were asked, Noemie and I were asked to speak at a Jewish school in London. And because it was so close to Shabbat, Noemie couldn't attend. So I did this one solo. And my speaker before me was a Holocaust survivor. And at the end, one of the girls asked her, what can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? And that speaker came up with an answer that really surprised me. She said, make friends with people who are not like you. Find people with different backgrounds, different religions, get to know them, understand them, make friends with them, and understand that we are all one human race. And this is echoing what Noemie has said. So find people who are different and don't expose the differences, celebrate them and celebrate our common humanity.
Thank you.
We can't hear you.
Oh, well, I haven't said anything yet.
Did you hear his speech, Mike?
Oh.
Eh? Very moving.
Are we right?
I found it more moving than hers. You know, hers was just another story.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry, I mean, yes. Can you hear me okay? Yes, oh, good, lovely. Well, look, just want to say thank you again for your, well, the wonderful presentations with a tremendously profoundly sad topic that we all listen to. But before we sign off, I would very much like to thank Anna Wolf and Vivian Radomski for the technical assistance for this very tricky performance of Zooming, streaming and recording, which would be totally beyond my abilities, and I want to thank them both especially for making this evening so successful all over the world. So thank you again, and it's been a pleasure to see you and to meet you online.